Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Esper, Director of Performance Measurement and Improvement at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. WDI is an independent nonprofit research and educational organization guided by our founding principle that thriving businesses drive economic development and improve social welfare in low and middle income countries. Our mission is to equip economic decision makers in emerging countries with the tools for commercial success. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Global Speaker Series. The series features thought leaders, practitioners, and innovators who share their experiences and stimulate discussion around opportunities and challenges of business to address global challenges. Our audience today includes students and faculty across a number of schools at the University of Michigan. And due to the virtual nature of this talk, we're excited to have colleagues from around the globe joining us as well. We're delighted that today's presentation is co-sponsored with Poverty Solutions, a university initiative that partners with communities and policymakers to find new ways to prevent and alleviate poverty. Mara Osfeld is the Associate Faculty Director of Poverty Solutions, will be moderating today's session with me. We're really excited about today's presentation from Daryl Collins. But before we dig into the conversation, I want to remind our attendees that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions and comments in the chat. We look forward to a meaningful conversation and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. I also invite you to check out resources and tune in for additional events and find other ways to connect with our work at our respective websites, wdi.umich.edu and poverty.umich.edu. It is now my pleasure to introduce Daryl Collins. As a pioneer working at the intersection of finance and human vulnerability, Collins has built a broad portfolio of work with financial service providers, foundations, bilateral donors, and governments. Collins' work is grounded in a deep understanding of the financial lives of individuals. She's the author of this groundbreaking, oh no, you can't really see it. I have the book, but my background is virtual, so you can't see it. But she's the author of the groundbreaking Portfolios of the Poor, which I referenced heavily in my early years at WDI to inform a study we designed and implemented in Andhra Pradesh. She's also the creator of the Financial Diaries, a research tool used in over 10 countries. Collins recently established Dakotas with a team of linguists and natural language processing data scientists. Dakotas seeks to advance scale and robustness in qualitative research techniques by providing tech-led research methods that are insightful, scalable, and low cost. The Dakotas team is currently working on a range of products across the breadth of countries, language, and sectors to explore new ways of both collecting and analyzing open-ended response data. Collins holds a bachelor's and master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics and a PhD from New York University. She spent the last decade as managing director and CEO of BFA, a niche financial inclusion consulting practice with offices across the globe. Daryl's talk today is timely as the COVID-19 pandemic has forced much data collection to be conducted remotely. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Daryl.
Thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate it. There we go. I'm just going to get my slides up. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. And I'm very eager to tell you more about what we're doing at Dakotas. So let me jump right in so that we have plenty of time for discussion, which is really where things get interesting. So I started thinking about these new data collection methodologies right around the time that COVID started happening. Now, the way I had done financial diaries throughout the years is tech-led. I mean, I built a specially formulated relational database to make the financial diaries really tick and to get the breadth of the fine-grained information that we use to create portfolios of the poor. And so that might not have been entirely understood that database is really what made everything work. And so in some ways, I feel like I'm going back to my roots, back to the place that I really, really enjoyed and back really to research after running this financial inclusion consultancy for 10 years. And so what ended up happening at COVID is that I, like all of you, said, well, how am I supposed to get into the field? How am I supposed to do what I do? And I joined with Commonwealth, which is a wonderful NGO, nonprofit here in Massachusetts, who works on financial inclusion in the US. And we talked about, well, what if we did a financial diaries, but did it completely remotely, but also they wanted to bring down the cost of doing research. So they said to me, hey, we need to make this cheaper. And so I thought, okay, need to make it cheaper. And I realized, well, wait a minute, we can use interactive voice recording, IVR, and that means that you don't pay for researchers to travel and to go and talk to everyone, which is really where the bulk of the costs come in. They also said to me, hey, we really like qualitative research, so we want you to really make sure that you're capturing not just people's financial flows, but also how they're feeling about their finances. And I thought, okay, all right, let's see if we can do that. And both of those requests open up this world for me. And I started listening to the recordings that would come in from these interviews from these Americans at the very beginning of COVID. And their voices boomed, or they were very quiet. And they answered questions in ways that I didn't expect. And I realized, wow, there's data in here, and I've just been throwing it away. I can't believe it. I wish that I had always done research like this. So one of the big drivers of creating Dakotas was not to create tech for the sake of tech. To be honest, if we can do things in a less technical way, but it works better, it creates more power of the research, we completely do that. But we do want to drive down the cost of research and make this qualitative research scalable. And I find that it is more revelatory because, again, people answer open-ended questions in ways that certainly I don't expect. Every single study I get surprised, which is great. So we've done a lot of different studies so far. We've been operating for about a year and a half now. And we really want to be sector agnostic and geography agnostic and language agnostic. We want to cover the gamut because at the end of the day, we want to find some of the commonalities that you might find in language. And so this is just a range of different issues that we've covered. So within this Diary Light project that we did with Commonwealth, we captured via IVR. So what would happen is I did the initial interviews, and I have 4 other researchers, and they did initial interviews with us live so that the respondent was used to our voice. They knew who we were. And then we pushed surveys through IVR, and this went on for about 5 months. And it was really surprising that we had very little attrition and that respondents really kept doing the survey, that they really responded. And I found that not only could we get really nice diaries-like data, but we also fed in how people were feeling about their finances. So we could drill down to a household level, for example, and really understand how people were managing all their money. And what struck me was, wow, if I can do this in an automated way, suddenly the sample size constraints that I always felt with financial diaries, they kind of go away. Suddenly, I could do financial diaries with 1,000 respondents, and it would cost much less, and I could keep up with all the data that's coming in, and I could ask open-ended questions. And as someone who's worked largely on smaller end studies, it was a very powerful feeling to realize that suddenly I could make this into a large end study. And how delightful is that, frankly? We're now going to be using the same type of thinking in terms of this repeat methodology. In other words, repeating over a period of time to investigate the journey of small businesses in Latin America and the digitization journeys. And again, we're intermingling both how much do you digitize your sales or your vendor payments with, well, let's say you have this digital tool. What's difficult about it? How do you feel about it? If you've abandoned it, why? Who did you help to teach you about it? What do you think? And that is, so far, we're collecting the first survey on this. And what's interesting with these audio recordings, you can hear that people are talking slowly. And that's interesting because it indicates that they haven't thought about some of these questions. Nobody's asked them. They haven't paused and asked. And they're full answers. And they've got lots of variation, and they're long, and they're saying lots of things, but they're speaking slowly with lots of pauses. You can hear them thinking. And so insights like that, you really can't get unless you have the acoustic analysis. So let me tell you a little bit, let me do a little bit of a deeper dive into a study that we did with Fundacion Capital. And this is an example in Paraguay. We've just completed this with them also in Colombia. So Fundacion Capital, which operates in Latin America, has been working on a graduation program, one piece of which is shifting gender norms. And the way that they are doing this, they're trying to drive their costs down. So they're pushing audio and infographic material to the women that they're working with. So rather than meeting them in a group-based system, which can be very expensive, both in terms of labor and travel, they're rather creating materials and pushing them through WhatsApp, because most of these women have a smartphone and they use WhatsApp. And what they asked us to do is very early on in this program, they wanted to know, are we hitting the right note with these women? In terms of the gender norms that we're trying to influence, are they already way ahead of us, or is there a lot to shift? And so what we did is we piggybacked on their existing infrastructure. And in order to create this material, they created a character named Lucy. And Lucy was sort of their guide with all this material. And we thought, well, where would it make sense? Like if you're going to push a survey to these women, who is this person? Who's this person talking? And so we needed to create a character called Jolie. And the interview was about, hey, I am helping out Lucy, and I just want to ask your opinion on some things. And I'm interested in hearing from you. So there were about 10 open-ended questions, and we recorded Jolie's voice, not just in Spanish, but actually in the local Jopara. So I'm just going to play that for a moment.
Maesha pa, Sherera Jolie. Te quiero hacer unas preguntitas. Estamos queriendo saber qué opinan las mujeres sobre los roles que tienen los miembros de la familia en la casa.
So what's happening here is people have this sense, the respondents have a sense that they're talking to someone who's just like them. It's not me, the American going into the field. It's not even the educated person from the city. It's someone who sounds like them, someone who feels like them. And therefore, when they answer the questions, it's almost as if they're talking to themselves. We're very, very carefully removing the social bias that you have when a researcher talks to a respondent. We find it makes a really big difference. Right now, we're doing some work with Rock University in Bangladesh, and we've simply recorded 3 questions in a large-scale survey. We opened up the questions, And the enumerators just simply recorded themselves and the response from the respondent. And it is amazing to see how the enumerators talk over the respondent, sort of push them around, and the reaction from the respondent to get defensive or close down their answers or just close them up. This automated way of asking questions is not just cheaper and more scalable. You actually get more open responses from people. And at the end, they feel consulted and not researched. And that's a huge objective of what we want to accomplish. So what we would do is then collect these open-ended audios. We would push them for transcription and translation, although we're getting more used to doing analysis using NLP directly in Spanish. We'll be using NLP directly in Hindi on some of our next studies because half my team is based in India. But we'll use natural language processing to tease out what respondents say. So some people might know natural language processing from the call center world, which is where really a lot of the talent in the coding behind this is. My data scientist comes from that world and has shifted his focus to the social science research world with me. They think about topic modeling. In other words, pulling up a topic. So you can imagine in a call center, the code is listening for a keyword, and that keyword might lead you on to the next part of the menu. So when you apply it to social science research, it still gives you keywords. But we're finding that topic modeling is not enough. And topic modeling is what's kind of sexy. That's the like machine learning, what have you. But we're finding for our research, it's not enough. We can't just have a keyword. So for example, here's a question from the gender norm study, which was, is it okay for your partner to look at your phone? And the keyword that came up all the time was trust. But if you look a little bit deeper, we used topic classification, which allowed us to look for phrases. So what is around that word trust? We knew trust was important, but what's around it? And we found two different themes. Well, if I trust them, I don't need to check their phone, versus we check our phones because that's how we grow trust. And as you can imagine, the first statement is much more progressive, much more rights-based. The second is more suspicious and jealous. Two completely different meanings. So we're actually finding topic classification, which frankly has a lot less machine learning behind it, but is much more appropriate to exactly what we're trying to do, to tease out the themes. But, when you're not right there sitting in an interview with a respondent, you are missing out on sort of a whole, sixth sense of what's going on. So we've designed this research to try to awaken every piece of data that we can. And so, like I said in the beginning, when I would hear this audio, I'd hear huge differentiation between people's voices from week to week and certainly from each other. And what I discovered is that that's the analysis of acoustics is often done by a sociolinguist. So I discovered a new field, and I can't believe how rich this field is. There are, in fact, I have 2,000 plus papers. There's actually more like 20,000. This world keeps opening up to me the more that I start working with linguists. And a lot of what they write papers about is from different parts of the world. They attach different speech signals to emotions. And those papers are about, can you consistently attach the same speech signals to different languages? So a New York accent compared to, the Himba in Namibia within the context of Namibia, do the same signals actually relate to the same emotion? And that's what this whole body of literature is about. So based on that, there are about 28 different speech signals that we could use. We have a few favorites that we've been working with, and we're growing them the more that we understand what is relevant for the types of questions we want to put to this data. So one is pitch, and pitch is a high voice or a low voice. Another is intensity. Do you speak loudly or softly? And another is this pitch modulation, which shows engagement in many ways. And then duration is super powerful, not just the duration of the whole response, but like I said, with the small business owners in Latin America, it's the duration of what we call the utterance. So somebody might say something, then pause, and then say something else. What we find is that there's a pattern that we find very useful where somebody will give an immediate response and then they'll mitigate it. And there's often a pause. So they'll say something like, it's good, but, and everything of importance comes after the but. And having that pause, it helps you to realize that this is sort of the socially acceptable thing to say in the beginning, but this is really the bit where the meat is. So let me show you an example of that. This again is from Paraguay. And this is a question asked to women about child labor, whether child labor was okay. Here's the first woman. So what she's saying is exactly the type of thing that we're talking about. This is a woman who says, oh yeah, no, they shouldn't be working. They should certainly be in school, but they need to learn how to work hard. They need to learn how to sacrifice. So, and this is someone who spoke for 44 seconds, which is a little on the long side. And her pitch modulation goes up and down, and she means it. That's kind of what pitch modulation tells us. Now, to be clear, we're not comparing each of these respondents to each other. We're normalizing each respondent to themselves across other questions. So a lot of what we're looking for is, oh, that's interesting. On this question, she's talking for longer, she really means it. But on this question, she's giving me a little bitty 4-second, for example. And so that's the difference. That's why we're not comparing people across cultures and languages. We're comparing people to themselves across a range of questions. And that normalization is what helps us pick up these patterns. So what we then do is combine what people say with how they say it. And so, for example, if you look at what people say at first on this question of child labor, most people say some amount of, oh no, they should certainly be going to school, they should not be working. And if this was a Likert scale, you'd see that most people are strongly agreeing with this statement. But if you break that down and lay in how people are mitigating or how they might be responding in this super short way, which we call sort of a canned answer, when people are telling you what they think you want to hear. And then if we blend in some of the uncertainty signals and the lack of engagement, we come out with this very different look where it's about half of the sample is really engaged. Like when they say, oh no, we agree with this statement, children should not work outside the home. What they're saying is, and let me give you 4 reasons why. There's this one, and their voices are strong, they're talking long, they have reasons. Whereas the others are like, well, you know, it's not my fault. Their uncles persuades them and lets them think that the money's so helpful. Or they might say, well, what do you mean? Do you mean 13? Do you mean 14? They mitigate somehow. And so what this told Fundacion Capital is that if you were just using a Likert scale, for example, they might say, all right, that's it. Our work is done. Gender norms are shifted. Labor, child labor, nobody really believes in it anymore. But with this method, well, now hold on, we're not done yet. There's a couple things that you might want to shift these materials to get those really strong responses up, maybe as time goes on. Remember that they let us into this really early in their intervention. So they weren't trying to prove impact. They were trying to get sort of a level setting to make sure that they were sort of meeting women where they were and in the right place on an issue like this. So let me just talk a little bit more on just one other subject, really different one, where we used natural language processing to sort of assess digital lending apps in India. And what was kind of cool about this was pure natural language processing. We took data from Google Play reviews and from Twitter. Now, this is just tweets and reviews. And we extracted those for about 1.5 years. And there was, I don't know, anybody who's been following India during, right around sort of COVID peak time, there started to be a lot of concerns about people being abused through digital lending in India, which is unregulated. And so our client CGAP wanted to know, well, what could we have seen this coming if we use some of these tools? And the reason why NLP is attractive is because it's inexpensive. It can handle this whopping amount of like super crazy data. Some of these tweets look almost incomprehensible. Can it do it quickly? Could we have actually seen what was happening? And how urgent are these signals? And so we ended up, and what are people worried about? So we did find that there was some early warning signals. And one of the benchmarks that we used is that there was a big set of media coming out about these problems in April 2020. And as you can imagine, these complaints just picked up because it was in the news. I mean, that's part of what Twitter, the hashtags were gathering around to sort of protest and inform everyone and become advocacy tools. But Google Play reviews actually picked this up earlier before that. And if this had been used as sort of this light supervisory tool, just a tool where you might get a signal that like, hey, there are these complaints about aggressive debt collection. Some of these lenders calling up everybody in your contact list and harassing them and threatening them. They might have been able to say, let's take a closer look. And also, who seem to be the worst offenders? Can we actually backtrack this to some particular apps to put a little bit more effort into investigating this? And so we continue to work with the RBI and different folks for thinking about how can we maybe think about doing this to be an extra tool, not the only tool, but an extra tool in the toolkit of SoupTech. So I'm going to stop there. I have more, but I actually would love to open up to questions and comments and thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Daryl. We've had a lot of activity in the chat, so I'm going to tee up a first question for you and then pass it to Mara to do the next question. So collecting data using WhatsApp increases researchers' ability to easily access stakeholders with smartphones. This has some risks, such as researchers sitting in an ivory tower to collect data and then not gaining an understanding of the context. At the same time, those without a smartphone or the internet access are excluded from the sample. Can you talk a little bit more about the use case for this type of data collection, maybe how it should be used in combination or when it should be used or not used?
Yeah, I'm going to jump back in, show you a little bit more. Here's a really good example of a population who are young women who were experiencing their first job in India. Now, there's no way we could have reached them with either WhatsApp, certainly, and then our other tool is IVR, which is a phone call. Let me tell you why that type of automated data collection wasn't going to work with these women. It really had to do with getting them on the phone. So the holder of the phone, and these are low-income workers who are around Lucknow, and they worked in a textile factory. And we did this on behalf of an impact investor called Upaya Social Ventures. And they wanted to know, did these women experience in their first jobs, dignified jobs? We ended up doing live phone interviews because we found that the holder of the phone, and this was just a basic phone, this wasn't a smartphone as it turned out, because these guys were further on, lower down the income curve. The holder of the phone was, generally speaking, the father of the house. And we wanted to talk to the daughters of the house. Now, as you can imagine, talking to a young woman in a family alone in India, really hard to do. You go into the field and you start an interview and everybody crowds around. So the likelihood of actually getting privacy with this type of respondent is very, very minimal. So we thought, well, how do we get past this dad? How do we get him to hand the phone over to her? And, is it respect? Is it information? Is it an extra incentive? It was an extra incentive. Hey, we'll send you data if you let us talk to your daughter. Here's what we want to talk to her about, but she has to be in a quiet place. She has to be in a very quiet place. And we found that we were able to record those interviews and then go through this process. And it was really interesting. We found that the conversations, well, first of all, we did find that there were problems at work, which I'm not going to disclose what they are because it's a little bit too sensitive, of some of the sample, which we never expected to see. And part of what we could tell is not just how this particular respondent, what she was talking about, but how she was talking. So this was her pitch and intensity. And pretty early on in the conversation, she introduced this problem to our researcher, who was, again, a young woman speaking Hindi. Granted, she was educated and from Delhi, so that created a little bit of a difference in sort of seniority. But this respondent went way up in pitch and intensity as she was talking through this problem. And in fact, asked this researcher to come and speak to her boss. And the researcher said, hey, I can't. And so she became very resigned. And you can see that with the pitch and intensity. It just helped us to really triangulate that this is something that this woman was angry and frustrated, and this was not a good job experience. And she didn't know how to deal with it. This respondent did not have such big changes. And you can see that her pitch and intensity isn't nearly as broad. So we go ahead and use different methods where appropriate to reach those respondents. One of the projects that we are doing soon, I don't know if I have this here, but we're collecting digital portfolios in India, Kenya, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And obviously, I don't have this here. We want to get to those who don't have a phone, but they have experience of digital. They probably borrow a phone for games, or they might have a shared Facebook account, or they might every now and then send a WhatsApp message using a shared phone or a friend's phone. They still have a digital footprint, even if they don't have a phone. What we're going to do there is we're still going to create an IVR interview, but there's enough bodies on the ground that those on the ground staff will hand a device to the different people that we recruit. So it's not as automated, not as low cost, but it's very different for a volunteer or a staff member on the ground to hand devices to 10 women and then get them back than to have interviews with those 10 respondents. So it's still more scalable, even if we can't use automation, but we have to get to those people who don't have a device of their own. And again, the IVR is phone calls, and we're finding that we're kind of liking that better than WhatsApp. Like it works. We executed a pretty big survey in South Africa, and we just used phone calls because these days people are ignoring their WhatsApp messages a lot more, depending on where you're talking about. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you, Daryl. And it helps answer, I think, part of the question. The other part, I think, is really, and we have another question related to this. I'm just going to go in a little bit deeper, is maybe it sounds like in all the examples that you've shared so far, you're working with a partner that's located in the location.
Completely.
Yeah. So
100%. 100%. Can't do it otherwise.
Yeah, there were some questions about the fear of maybe doing this from an ivory tower and trying to collect data and losing the sense of the environment and context. But that relates really nicely to a question. Well, I'm just going to ask it at this point and then turn it to Mara for the next one. Are there situations or contexts when you think that these methods might be inappropriate to use, or do you feel like you lose any data by not doing the research in person? I mean, the IVR, some of this you've talked about a little bit, but just if you could share your thoughts on that question.
I think that there are pros and cons. One place that we're experimenting with in Kenya, again, with a local partner, we have to have local partners. And actually, it's kind of a little bit more fun that way, to be honest. But we're experimenting with using these methods in focus groups. I think it's going to be a little wild. The data collection of the audio might not work that great. I think there's a lot of situations where the how gets in the way in our open-ended questions and recordings on the large survey in Bangladesh. The audio ended up being terrible. We had to throw away a whole bunch of the data. And even that was super difficult to transcribe and translate. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more of a believer that this idea of not putting a person in the field, because you almost always have somebody who has some seniority, some cultural seniority, because it's usually the field researcher tends to be more educated. Even if they speak the same language, they might be from the city. And so the urge of the respondent to try to figure out, what do you want to hear? And am I answering the question correctly, is very powerful. And it's a wonderful thing. I mean, we pilot our questions to death to make sure that people understand them, and they just start talking. One of the best answers is when you hear, well, I don't know if this is what you were looking for, but, and off they go. And that tells us, okay, so a good example is a man in California with the Commonwealth work. We'd ask him how he's feeling about his finances, and he would answer with his faith. And it was very sort of, finance and faith was very entangled. And that's, you know, well, I've got what I need. I don't have what I want, but I have faith. I have more time for my faith. I have more time for my relationship with God. And okay, great. That's where you went first to answer this question. You weren't trying to figure out, where did I want you to go? That is what your first instinct was. And I find that really very informative.
I would love to ask a little bit more about any hesitations you've observed when inviting people to use these digital tools. Are there people who are more comfortable using these tools and people who are less comfortable? And tell us more about that.
Interestingly, we're doing some work right now on the impact of broadband internet in a South Delhi neighborhood. And as we were piloting, we came to realize, wow, this is a very middle-class community. And they didn't want to say anything about, we might say like, hey, who's in your family? Tell me all about your family. And they're like, why do you want to know about my family? They'd feel very reserved. So there were a lot more hot topics because how we identified ourselves was more unnerving to them. So, I think if you walk up and are present, then you know who this person is asking these questions. You have a physical identity and you can see them. And so you feel less suspicious. Whereas I feel like lower income people, it's like, wow, thank you for asking me. I can talk. There's more of a sense of this creating agency. So I'd say that it might be a little opposite to what you think, as long as we can get sort of beyond the technology. For certain people, being able to not be judged in what they have to say is very liberating, and it's a really good experience. Youth in South Africa, when asked about their hustling and gig work, just glowed. I'm super proud of what I'm doing for various reasons. The women with small businesses in Latin America, wow, hey, let me tell you about my vendors. This guy really bugs me, and that one's late all the time. And I have never been able to complain to anybody, but boy, are you going to get an earful. And they get to just talk about things that they're not often asked about.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Another question we're getting from the audience is, how do you know that participants are perceiving the tech in a manner like it's talking to someone like them with no biases? Did you do any research about the participant experience? And I'll pop in the chat a Next Billion article that you wrote with some of your colleagues at Fundacion Capital that talks about the person you used for the voice in that research.
Yeah, I think we almost always ask about what did you think about these questions? Were they important? And one of the interesting things that came up in the gender norms survey is that we ask about, should you teach your children about private parts? And the respondents to that question just, their answers are shorter. You can hear that they don't want to be talking about this. But when they are asked that question, they say, no, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's actually really important. So we almost always ask, tell me if you think we asked good questions. Was there other questions you thought we should have asked? And we know that we're doing something right when they say, yeah, that was a good one. Or, hey, why didn't you ask me about this? And because it's so open-ended, people feel free to say, like, you left out the most important part. What are you, crazy? And they can sometimes say something that is different to what we might hear from a particular question. So that's the reason why we ask that, is because of that experience.
I wanted to ask a couple other questions that kind of combine some questions we're getting in from the audience. One person just asked you to describe the analysis process in a bit more detail. Lisa Zook asked that. And then Karen McPhail Bell asked a similar question or built on this in asking about, tell me more about how this is different from answering qualitative questions quantitatively. A lot of it talking about measuring, like using machine learning to look at topic themes and measuring the voice inflections. Tell me more about how this is different from just using quantitative and analysis tools.
So I think one of the biggest wild cards that we don't think about is what it's like for an enumerator doing a quantitative survey, and how tired and frustrated they might be and how anxious they are. to just get a question answered. So again, in the work that we're doing in Bangladesh is so enlightening because it's your classic population representative, big, huge survey about how people are coping with COVID. And what we're doing with Brock is we selected 3 questions that they felt they hadn't really gotten a handle on in the past 2 panels that they had done the same survey. And they had hypotheses that were like really diametrically opposed. And they just couldn't get at them. So what we did is we redesigned the question so that it was super open-ended. But when they put the survey in the field, they recorded the enumerator asking and the respondent responding, but then they also asked the respondent to code the question and they gave multiple choice. And it has been very illuminating. There was one question, for example, that we've just looked at, which was about, hey, if you could be, aside from food, what would really help you get back on your feet? And the potential answers and what people actually said from the recording and the NLP were just completely divergent, as were how the enumerators coded everything. And so you just got this completely different picture. And also people were just getting like kind of pissed off at the question. Like, you're not going to give me anything. Like, what do you, like, really? Really? And, you know, it was just a really, you could tell that like this question was being asked. And I think the expectation was to get a list and a priority of like, okay, get out there and give them this, this, and this. And that was not happening in that interface between enumerator and respondent. It was just, you couldn't do anything with it. You couldn't get any information other than this was a bad question. So don't take it seriously. So it's things like that. It's things like that, you know, where you have really, you have to be contextually specific. You have presupposed notions about what that context looked like. You have a presupposed notions about who you're talking to. And you assume that the respondent sitting on the other end of that survey feels that they have agency to express themselves. They don't. The enumerator is more educated and way more focused on just getting this stupid survey done. And you can hear it in that interface. And so we then take the data from that experience and we say, oh, look at that. Here's what people want. And we're wrong. We're just like wrong. So in that type of question, it doesn't work. On plenty of other questions, it does. What I'd like to see is a blending where you can do a survey like that and take open-ended questions and just take the enumerator out of the picture so that, you know, so that you don't have that type of social bias. I just think we would answer questions way better. And you could do it at scale once again, and you get a clean data capture. If you're calling people and they respond, you know, and IPA and JPAL have been doing a lot over COVID of how you can create a robust sample without being on the ground through IVR, which thank God they're doing this because that's not going to be my cup of tea. They're way better at that. What I'm focusing on are the questions and the analysis. So the measurement, you know, what are we asking the right questions and are we getting the right answers?
Okay, I just want to follow up. So I think that's what a lot of people were wondering is how are you making sure that presupposed notions aren't guiding like the way you're measuring outcomes? And so can you say a little bit more about how you're ensuring that, how you're like both, because that's often the problem or the critique of quantitative analyses and machine learning, that you have these inputs and like these very predetermined notions of what the outcomes should look like. But you're saying that you can somehow determine that if that's not, that if there's flaws in those quantitative analysis techniques, there's something else that you're doing that ensures that your data is not reduced to that.
So we do tend to take this in steps. So we do the NLP first, and we say like, well, what are people saying? And again, it's outrageously important that we don't use topic modeling to do that, the machine learning, because it will only give us keywords. And let me tell you, if we try to do analysis just using topic modeling, it's gobbledygook. It gives you a little bit of initial clues. It's super fast. It will give you keywords and you say, okay, all right, let's look at the keywords and let's do topic classification and let's build out the phrasing. And the angling of those questions, it's qualitative research. It's very inductive. So in other words, we'll say, wait a minute, this is a different notion than what we might be supposing that it is, such as that word trust. And because we're sort of starting with those themes, and then we're seeing if the acoustics show clear differences. How do the acoustics add? So it's what people are saying and how they're saying it. And that's how we know, for example, in Bangladesh, that what's actually happening is that people might give you some of the things that they would value, but they were saying it in this very, with very flat speech signals, with very diminished speech signals, not hopeful, not, so the emotions tagged to that were not, well, let me give you a list. Let me tell you what would be really, it wasn't confident. It was diminished. And so what the acoustic analysis is doing is triangulating the picture. And so what you end up here with is really not measuring impact, right? It's not. You have none of that. There's no pre and post. There's no randomization. There's no nothing. We're just trying to describe a situation. So what we're really focused on is saying, well, what questions should we be asking? How do we look at this? And therefore we're taking the inductiveness of qualitative research, but we're creating codes that can be run across large amounts of data to say, here's the notion that these people are picking up on, and here's the notion that those people are picking up on. And that's where the power comes in. And then we're triangulating it with the acoustics, because it really isn't enough to just do that. You can still get it way wrong or really misread just the NLP. And again, the most powerful tools are not the sexiest at all.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd be looking at sentiment analysis and that type of thing.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for breaking down that process in more detail. That was really helpful, and I think answered a number of other questions we've been getting. I'm gonna, some of the questions, one question from Sadiq Shoka has, part of it's been answered, but I think there's an element I wanna tie back into our conversation now is, if a respondent doesn't understand the question, how do you localize the language? Because you're talking about sending this out to a large sample sometimes. And there's different dialects within some of those samples. And sometimes enumerators can be so helpful for adapting a word in the middle of the interview. They're not changing or rewording the whole question, but maybe they'll just fix a word that maybe one particular respondent has a hard time with. And I know you do all this piloting and pre-testing to try to avoid this, but curious, because you are trying to scale qualitative research and you're trying to send it out to a large group, how do you make sure you're still hitting those segments and tailoring to them?
So what's interesting here, I mean, that's one of the beauties, is that if you think about it, who's reading the questions? Well, there's a voice, and sort of an identity. Who are those voices? We use voice actors. And we can use 10 dialects. And we pay 10 voice actors. Well, 20, because we'll probably have a male and a female. And maybe then we might have, so we'll run, we can, it's costless, nearly costless. I mean, it's the time, it's maybe 8 hours, depending how long the survey is, of a voice actor's time. And then that just, you use that on that particular sample. Or you give people a choice. Or you say, you know what, and a big part of what we're doing is not, hey, this person's Hindi is not so good. We're rather saying, go ahead, talk in your dialect. Sounds good to me. Use whatever language you want. And if they get asked in dialect, then they'll answer in dialect, and they will answer in their most articulate selves if they answer in their most home language. And then we have transcribers and translators who will, and we outsource that, who will translate and transcribe in that dialect. So it's not about, hey, let's get the perfect Hindi, unless we're signaling to a Hindi audience who would naturally speak in Hindi. So it's not people misunderstanding. It really isn't. It's a signal to say, go ahead, use, I mean, in a recent South African survey, we created, this was awesome. So some of the youth in South Africa has 11 national languages. And in Gauteng, in Johannesburg, they mix. So it's Sotho, it's Pedi, it's Xhosa. And it turned out that there's a pattern to this mix. And so we created, one of our field researchers was able to pick up on exactly how this language is mixed. And so we had a voice actor just use that language. You can imagine just hearing sort of this, like, oh my God, they speak my language. Oh, I just love you. I'll tell you everything. It's a signal. And then they were switching between Xhosa and that's fine. Good. We can handle that. Use whatever language and whatever word you want, because we want you at your most articulate.
Great, thank you. And we're pretty much at time. So we really, really want to thank you for sharing your thoughts and participating today. And we want to thank all of you at home and in your offices that tuned in and participated. We appreciate your insightful contributions and questions. The presentation and recording and slides are going to be shared with all of those that registered. And then the recordings will also be available on the WDI YouTube channel afterwards. So thank you again, Daryl. Thank you everyone again for participating.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you.